800,000 Thai baht. It's a number that just goes around and around in my head. Even now, it sounds like something a millionaire would talk about, but it comes out to about 25,000 US dollars. For a man like me, a retired HVAC guy from Indiana, that's a fortune. That was the sin sod. That's what they call the dowry in Thailand. It was supposed to be a payment to honor her family, to show them I was serious, that I was a man who could provide for their daughter. And I paid it, every last cent. I sent it from my retirement account, the money I'd spent 35 years putting away, bit by bit. We had a party after that. I can't really call it a wedding, not in the way we think of one back home, but there was music and food, and I was the guest of honor. For the first time in years, since my wife Susan passed, I felt important. I felt like I had a future again. For exactly 7 days, I was living that future. I was the happiest man on earth. I woke up every morning in this little village thinking, this is it. This is my reward for a lifetime of hard work. And then, on the 8th day, she said she was going to visit a sick aunt in another province. She packed a small bag, kissed me goodbye, and promised she'd be back in a couple of days. She never came back. Her phone went dead the next morning. The family members I had met, the smiling faces at the party, gone. The number for her uncle, the man I'd wired the money to, disconnected. It was all smoke. I'm Gary. I'm 64 years old, and this is the story of how I bought myself the most expensive week of happiness a man could ever imagine. And I need to tell you how a man who could diagnose a faulty compressor from 100 feet away could miss every single warning sign and pay $25,000 for a one-week fantasy. To understand how I got there, you have to understand the man I was before any of this happened. For 35 years, I worked as an HVAC technician in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Same company, same town, same neighbors waving at me from the same driveways for 3 decades. I was the guy you called when your air conditioner gave out in the middle of a heat wave, when the furnace stopped working on the coldest night of January. I could tell you what was wrong with a system just by the sound it made: a failing bearing, a refrigerant leak, a clogged filter, before I'd even opened the access panel. I could fix things, real, tangible things that you could put your hands on. I took a lot of pride in that. My life was built on a simple principle. You put in the work, you save your money, and you earn your security. And I did. I had a 401k with about $450,000 in it, a monthly pension of $1,200, and the house was paid off. It wasn't a mansion, just a solid, quiet home in a neighborhood where I knew everybody's name. I wasn't rich, but I was secure. I had done everything right. My wife, Susan, and I were married for 30 years. It was a good life, simple. We weren't flashy people. We had our routines, our regular Friday dinners at the Italian place on Main Street, our Sunday mornings with the paper. We knew what to expect from each other, and there was real comfort in that. And then, 5 years ago, cancer took her. It was fast, which people tell you is a mercy, though I'm not sure I've ever agreed with that. And for the first few years after, work kept me going. The routine was my anchor, but then came retirement, a year ago, and the silence in that house. It became deafening. All the structure I'd built my life around, the job, the marriage, the purpose of being somewhere every day and being needed, it was just gone. I found myself adrift. I tried dating, went out a few times with women my age here in Indiana. It was awkward and uncomfortable in a way I hadn't expected. I felt like I was speaking a different language, like the world had moved on without me, and I was still living in a decade that didn't exist anymore. It just made me feel more invisible than before. The idea of Thailand didn't come out of nowhere. It was planted. I was at the hardware store one Saturday, and I ran into a guy I used to work with, maybe 30 years younger than me. He'd just gotten back from a trip over there, and his face lit up talking about it. He showed me pictures on his phone, the beaches, the food, the temples. He went on about how cheap everything was, how friendly the people were, how much they respected older men, and he talked about the women, how they were kind and traditional. He didn't mean anything by it. He was just excited about his trip. But that night, I went home to that big empty house, and his words were echoing in my head. The loneliness felt like a physical weight sitting on my chest. For the first time in my life, I sat down at my computer and typed something I never thought I would. American expat dating in Thailand. It felt like a betrayal of the man I thought I was, but it also felt like the first spark of something that might be called hope. And that's where she came in. Her name was Lek. She was 42, from a small village, she said. Her first messages were everything I hadn't realized I was starving for. Respectful, curious, and they made me feel like I was still a man worth talking to. Our conversations went on for 8 months. Every morning I'd wake up, make a cup of coffee, and there would be a message from Lek waiting for me. "Good morning, Gary. I hope you have a wonderful day." It sounds so simple, but to a man living alone in a silent house, that small thing was everything. She asked about my work, the systems I used to fix. She wanted to see pictures of the old commercial units I'd worked on. She made me feel interesting, like my life story was worth telling to someone. And slowly, day by day, the silence in that house started to fill in at the edges. Then came the first test. Her mother was sick, she said. She needed medicine. It was about $150. And my first instinct, the one that came from 35 years of being the man who solved problems, was to fix it. That's what I do. A problem comes up. You don't sit around feeling sorry about it. You reach for a solution. So I sent the money. It wasn't a red flag to me. It was an opportunity, a chance to show I was a man who could be depended on. A few weeks later, her phone broke. The screen went completely black. How could we talk? Another $200. Each time, it was a small problem with a clear solution. And each time I solved it, I felt that old sense of purpose fire back up inside me. Over those 8 months, it added up to maybe $1,500 in total. In the grand scheme of my retirement account, it felt like nothing. It felt like what you'd spend on new tires. It was the cost of connection. That's how I thought about it. Finally, I said, "I'm coming to see you." I booked a 2-week trip to Udon Thani. I was more nervous than I'd been on my first date with Susan 30 years ago. I'm a guy from Indiana. The farthest I'd ever been was a fishing trip to Canada. Now I was flying halfway across the world to meet a woman I'd only ever seen through a screen. When I stepped out of that airport, the heat and the smells hit me like a physical thing. Thick, warm air, unfamiliar spices, diesel fumes, the sound of tuk-tuks. My whole body felt like it had woken up after a long sleep. And then I saw her. She was holding a little handwritten sign with my name on it, and she was just like her pictures. The smile was real, or at least it looked real in a way I'd been desperate to believe. For those 2 weeks, I wasn't a lonely old man from Fort Wayne. I was an honored guest. She introduced me to her mother and her uncle in this small, simple house in the village. They were all smiles. They treated me with a kind of respect I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't just Gary the HVAC guy, I was Mr. Gary. The experience was intoxicating. I was solving problems again. I was fixing the biggest problem of all, my own loneliness. It happened near the end of the trip. We were sitting outside one evening and Lek got quiet. She had tears in her eyes. She said that for us to have a real future together, for her to be my wife honorably, her family's honor had to be respected first. And then she said the words, "sin sod," the dowry. It was the proof, she explained, that I was a serious man, that I wasn't just a tourist passing through. Her uncle, the man I'd been sharing beers with all week, who'd clapped me on the shoulder and laughed at my jokes, came and sat with us. He did all the talking. He said the family had struggled, that raising a good woman cost something. The number they first mentioned was staggering, way more than I could ever afford. I felt the air go out of my lungs. But then the uncle started to negotiate for me. He talked them down. He made a big show of it, shaking his head, waving his hands, speaking in rapid Thai while I sat there watching. He was on my side, you see. The final number they landed on was 800,000 baht. He looked at me with a serious expression and said, "This is a good deal, Gary. This is fair." $25,000. I didn't see it as a payment for a wife. That's not what was going through my head. I was a man who understood transactions. You put in a new furnace, you get paid. This felt the same. I was making an investment in a new life. I was proving my worth. And in that moment, standing in that village with those people around me, feeling more alive than I had in 5 years, it felt like the most logical decision in the world. I flew back to Indiana, and for the first time in years, the house didn't feel empty. It felt like a temporary workspace. I had a project. My whole life, I'd been a man of plans and procedures. You don't install a commercial cooling system by winging it. You follow the schematics, step by step. This felt exactly the same. The next morning, I called the company that managed my 401k. I told the man on the phone I needed to liquidate $25,000. There was no hesitation in my voice. To him, it was just a transaction. To me, it was laying a foundation. I wasn't thinking about risk. I was thinking about the smile on Lek's face when I called her that night and told her I was a man of my word. A few days later, the money was in my account. I walked into the bank and wired the full 800,000 baht to the account number her uncle had given me. When I hit send, it wasn't a feeling of loss. It was a feeling of investment. I had just purchased the most valuable thing a man like me could own, a second chance. The next 3 months were filled with planning. I was on the phone with Lek every single day. We talked about the house we'd build, the small details of a life together. It was happening. It was real. I sold my truck, put my tools in storage, gave my landlord notice. This time, I bought a one-way ticket. When I landed in Udon Thani for the second time, it felt completely different. I wasn't a tourist anymore. I was coming home. When the driver pulled into her village, I could hear the music from 100 yards away. The place was transformed. Strings of lights hung between the houses, long tables covered in food I couldn't name, and what looked like the entire village standing out there in the warm evening air, smiling and waving. I stepped out of the car, and for a moment, I just stood there, taking it all in. This was real. This was my life now. And in the middle of it all was Lek. She ran up and threw her arms around me, and the whole crowd let out a cheer that I will never, as long as I live, forget the sound of. For the rest of that evening, people I'd never met came up to shake my hand, to bow their heads slightly, to offer me food and drinks. They called me Mr. Gary, every single one of them. I sat there, a retired HVAC guy from Fort Wayne, Indiana, who'd spent his career on his knees under broken machinery, and I felt like a king, like I had finally arrived at a place that had been waiting for me all along. The $25,000 wasn't just a dowry to me anymore. It was the price of admission into this new life. And from where I was sitting that night, surrounded by music and light and people who seemed genuinely glad I was there, it was the best bargain I'd ever made in my life. That first week was the happiest of my life. The days were simple. We'd wake up, have breakfast, and just be together. The crushing weight of the silence I'd lived with for 5 years was gone, replaced by the sound of her laughter and the noise of village life around us. I felt like I was breathing fresh air for the first time since Susan died. Every morning I'd wake up and think, this is the payoff. This is what all those early mornings were for, all those frozen knuckles in the winter and the sweat stinging my eyes in the summer. I was 64 years old, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. And then, on the 8th day, something shifted. It was subtle, a quietness in her that hadn't been there before. I asked if everything was okay. She smiled and said she was just a little tired from the party. I was a man who had spent his life diagnosing problems. I could hear a failing bearing in a fan motor from across a room. But the warning signs in a person? I couldn't hear them at all. That evening, she told me her aunt in another province was sick. She needed to go visit for a couple of days. She packed a small bag, kissed me goodbye, and promised she'd call the next morning. I watched her get into a taxi and drive away. The only thing I felt was sympathy for her sick aunt. It never once occurred to me to question it. The next morning, I waited for her call. By noon, nothing. I told myself she was probably busy with family. I tried calling her. A recorded message in Thai, then English. "The number you have dialed is not in service." That was the first real jolt. It felt like grabbing a live wire with both hands. But the practical part of my brain took over immediately. There was an explanation. There was always an explanation. The battery was dead. She was in a rural area with no signal. Something simple. By the end of the second day, though, the silence in that little house was deafening. A heavier, more menacing silence than anything I'd left behind in Indiana. The panic started to crawl up my throat like something I couldn't swallow down. I hired a local driver to take me to the village. The whole ride, I was rehearsing what I'd say when I saw her. "Your phone died. I was so worried." When we pulled up, the house looked wrong. The festive lights were gone. The place just looked empty. I got out, heart pounding, and knocked on the door. A woman I'd never seen before answered. She looked at me with a blank expression. I said Lek's name. The driver translated. The woman shook her head. "No Lek here." I started to argue. "No, this is her family's house. We had a party right here, a week ago." The driver spoke to her again, then turned to me, his face grim. "She says she and her husband have lived in this house for 5 years. They don't know anyone named Lek. They don't know anything about any party." And that's when the circuit breaker in my brain finally tripped. 1 second there was hope. The next, there was only darkness. The family, the uncle, the party, the sick aunt. It was all a lie. Every last bit of it. I had been so focused on the beautiful picture, so proud of the life I thought I was building, that I never once thought to check the foundation. And it was all rotten from the start. I just stood there in the street with the sun beating down on my head, and I finally understood. I hadn't bought a future. I had paid $25,000 for a 1-week rental of a fantasy, and the lease was up. I gave the driver a 2,000 baht note and told him to keep it, and just walked. I didn't know where I was going. For a man who spent his whole life reading schematics, whose entire career was about knowing exactly where every wire ran and where every component connected, my own life map had just been torched. There were no more directions. For the next 2 days, I tried to troubleshoot the problem because that's all I knew how to do. I went to the tourist police. I sat in a stuffy little office and tried to explain what happened to a young Thai officer who spoke broken English. He was patient, but he had a look on his face I'd seen 1,000 times on customers back home. The look of someone hearing about a problem they already know is too far gone to fix. I showed him the wire transfer receipt. He just shrugged. "You gave a gift," he said. The sin sod wasn't a purchase. In the eyes of the law, it was a gift, willingly given. There was no crime on record. I didn't have a real last name for her. I didn't have a real address. The phone number was dead. The people I'd met were ghosts who dissolved back into thin air. It was like trying to diagnose a system with all the wires cut out. Nothing left to test. I wasn't a victim of a crime. I was the mark in a long con, and they run that con on men like me every single day. The flight back to Indiana was the longest 24 hours of my life. On the way over, I'd been full of purpose, full of the feeling of a man who finally knew where he was going. Now I was just a 64-year-old man in a middle seat with nothing but 12 hours of darkness and engine noise between him and the worst version of himself. The shame was a physical weight, heavy and solid, like a seized compressor unit I had to carry on my back for the entire flight. Every smiling face from that party kept flashing behind my eyes. They weren't celebrating me. They were laughing at me, the guest of honor, the rich American who was paying for the whole show and didn't even know he was in it. I had wanted so desperately to believe I was still a man worth wanting, still a man who mattered, and they had seen that hunger from thousands of miles away. They didn't see Gary Miller from Fort Wayne. They saw a walking ATM, and they knew the PIN code was loneliness. When I walked back into my house, the silence was waiting for me, but it was a different silence now. Before it had been sad and heavy, now it was mocking. Every empty room screamed the same word back at me: fool. For 5 years after Susan died, I'd been lonely. But now, for the first time in my life, I felt something worse than lonely. I felt like a fraud in my own life. Who was I? I wasn't the competent man who could fix anything anymore. I was the man who paid $25,000 for a one-week rental of someone else's fantasy. A week later, my 401k statement came in the mail. It sat on the kitchen table for 3 days before I opened it. I knew what it was going to say, but I made myself do it, because I'm a man who believes in looking at the damage squarely. You have to know the full extent of the failure before you can figure out what comes next. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table I'd sat at with Susan every morning for 30 years, and I spread the statement out in front of me. I ran my finger down the columns, and there it was, a withdrawal. $25,000, $450,000, down to $425. Just a line on a page, just a subtraction. But it wasn't. That line on that page was 35 years of early mornings. It was frozen knuckles in January, crawling under residential units in people's basements. It was August heat inside commercial buildings, where the AC was broken, and I was the man who had to fix it. It was weekends I didn't take, and overtime I didn't complain about, and every dollar I'd ever put aside, instead of spending it on something I wanted. It was the physical, measurable proof of my entire working life, and I had set a pile of it on fire to stay warm for 1 week. The worst part was, I couldn't tell a soul. My friends, my old coworkers, they see me as the solid, practical one. The guy who has his act together. How do you sit down with someone over a beer and say, I gave $25,000 to a woman I knew for 8 months through a screen? The shame walled me in completely. I had spent my whole career fixing things for other people, and here I was, facing the one breakdown I couldn't diagnose, couldn't repair, and had to face entirely alone. So here I am, 6 months later, back in the house in Fort Wayne. The silence is still here, but I'm working on filling it differently now. A bowling league on Tuesdays, a volunteer shift at the food bank on Wednesdays, small things that belong to the real world. My retirement account is no longer $450,000. That $25,000 hole is there every time I open my statement, a permanent scar in the numbers that I see every month and that reminds me every month of what I let happen. But the money isn't the real lesson. It's the tuition I paid for 3 things I need to tell you. The first lesson: the small gifts are not gifts, they are tests. When she said her mother was sick and needed $150, I thought I was being a good man. When her phone broke and I sent $200, I thought I was solving a problem, but I was being tested. They were checking the wiring, seeing if the current would flow. Each time I sent money, I passed their test, not mine. I was proving I was a man who would pay. If the small requests start, understand that this is not a test of your character. It's a test of your willingness to become an income source. It's the first leak in the system. Patch it right then and there, or the whole thing is going to flood. The second lesson is about honor. They use that word constantly. The sin sod was about honoring her family. I ate it up because I'm from a place where a man's word and his honor mean everything. I thought I was participating in a real tradition, but the tradition was being used as a weapon against me. I was so focused on being respectful that I never stopped to ask whether respect was being used to take me apart piece by piece. Don't let your desire to be a good man blind you to the fact that you're in a business deal where you are the only one putting up capital. And that leads to the final lesson, the most important one. This wasn't really about the money. It was about the loneliness. I was a man starving in the desert, and she offered me water. It didn't matter if it was poisoned. I was going to drink it. They knew it. They can smell that kind of desperation from thousands of miles away. I wasn't a fool because I'm stupid. I can rebuild a furnace from the ground up. I was a fool because I was lonely, and I wanted to feel like Mr. Gary, the respected man, the provider, the one who mattered, more than I wanted to protect the money I'd spent 35 years earning. I ignored every warning sign in my gut because admitting something was wrong would have meant going back to the silence. If you are lonely, you are vulnerable. You have to fix that first. You have to face the silence in your own house before you try to buy your way into someone else's. My pride is shot and my account is 25 grand lighter. I can live with that. I don't have a choice. What I can't live with is another man like me. Another man who worked hard his whole life, who did everything right, who just wanted something to look forward to, getting taken by the same story. So if you're sitting there, lonely and scrolling, thinking this is your answer, your heart is not a wallet. Don't let anyone convince you it is. Learn from my mistake. It's the cheapest lesson you'll ever get. I promise you that.